All right, guys. So today we are going to be diving into the Lean Startup, just the beginning of it. And I wanted to start this off by asking what you typically think of when you think of the difference between a successful entrepreneur and an unsuccessful entrepreneur.
Um, I've been around a lot of entrepreneurs. So I would say that, a successful entrepreneur is somebody that can take all of the chaos and sort of bring it into order to move in a particular direction. Unsuccessful one is someone that just can't seem to take all the pieces and make it all come together and might give up too easily or something along those lines. So that's a little simplistic, but it's high level.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
I think a little bit of time has to pass in order to be able to judge this. And then I think a good judgment would be like how long people have been working for that person. So yeah, I guess like some tenure. Not, it doesn't have to be obviously everyone, just like, do you have a couple of people that have been with you from the start? And I feel like that's a good indicator of kind of the health of the organization.
I was gonna say too, I feel like when I think about a successful entrepreneur, I think of like they're like big dreamers, but they know how to follow through and execute versus like maybe an unsuccessful entrepreneur is somebody who's like has like a really big dream and then they don't. Dave, you kind of touched on this, like they don't know how to put all the pieces together, but they don't get it to a point where it becomes successful. So it's just kind of like they have the idea, but then they don't execute.
So I absolutely agree. I think that there is a lot of, and that's kind of what came to my mind first. It's just that like there's so much going on and there's so many ideas and you often hear about like serial entrepreneurs, people who just kind of have these ideas and start things and then they move on. And then you also hear those things like they have a really great product. They were there for the right time. They have really big determination and perseverance and these kind of like American dream, rags to riches type of stories that we hear a lot. But in this book, it's really challenging that thought process of is it really like an American dream, rags to riches kind of thing? Or is this something that we more so learn? We typically see an entrepreneur and think of that person is just the entrepreneur type. They have the ideas. They're the ones who usually act like this. But this book really challenges that to say that entrepreneurship is something that can be taught and that there is a learning concept to it. So diving into that, this book really emphasizes the importance of these 5 principles. And we'll do a little overview on both of them, or on all of them. There's 5. And they are entrepreneurs are everywhere. Entrepreneurship is management, validated learning, build, measure, learn, and then innovation accounting. So starting with entrepreneurs are everywhere. In this book, a startup is defined as a human institution designed to create new products and services under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And it's this concept of entrepreneurs are everywhere is that everyone who is involved in any sort of startup is an entrepreneur. They have the opportunity to take that opportunity and really learn from it and enact that entrepreneurship. And that means that every company size, every type of sector, type of industry, there are entrepreneurs in every single one at every single business, especially in times of uncertainty. Next, sorry. With validated learning, it's really talking about that startups do not exist to just make stuff or make money or serve people or do these things that we typically kind of put in our vision of like, we want to do this for people. It's really focusing on the fact that startups exist to learn how to make their business sustainable. And that learning can look a lot different for a startup than it can for a really like large corporation in the fact of like if you're looking at Chase versus you're looking at a smaller company that's starting really small, then you can, sorry, I'm getting a little mixed up in my words. If you're starting with a company that's smaller, then you're able to use a different set of principles and a different way of judging success. So that gives you validated learning so that you can kind of apply a scientific principle to what you're building. The next thing is build, measure, and learn. It's turning ideas into products, measuring how customers respond, and then learning whether or not it's time to pivot or if it's time to persevere and just kind of push through that feedback rather than making a change. And we also have innovation accounting. And that is really talking about focusing on the boring stuff. And something that the book dives a lot into is talking about how entrepreneurship is typically seen as this like dynamic and chaotic and fun version of business, as opposed to regularly when you hear the term management, you think of kind of the paperwork, the policies, and the more quote unquote boring aspects. But in this book, it's saying that focusing on the boring stuff is really important. It's really important for us to measure progress and create milestones and prioritize work effectively so that we can get things done. And I really liked how it put that into words, like focusing on the boring stuff. As much as it sounds like the negative, it really is the positive, because those things really give guidelines to how the business can function rather than constraining it. It actually helps it grow. So the first chapter is called Start. And I really liked this quote that he had in it. And it says, entrepreneurship requires a managerial discipline to harness the entrepreneurial opportunity. Sorry, my notes are not loading. Sorry, I can't find it's not loading on my screen. Okay, there it is. So this is really talking about that entrepreneurship is management, and that's something that is definitely raises eyebrows with a lot of entrepreneurs, because they're like, well, no, I'm not here to manage people. I'm not here to manage the business. I'm not here to manage how everything's going. I'm here to make the idea happen and chase the vision. But the lean startup is a new way of looking at the development of innovative new products that emphasize fast iteration and customer insight and a huge vision and great ambition all at the same time. And it requires that managerial discipline to be able to make all of those things happen. So my next question for y'all is a startup more like a rocket ship or a car? And that's kind of, there's not, whatever y'all think. What do you think? And maybe give me a why.
Think it depends, because some of them will start off and just kick off immediately like a rocket ship, and some of them will kind of go a little slower like a car. I think it just depends on what product or service or industry it's in and how well thought of was the original vision and how do you execute. I think it comes down to like having the right situation, people, team, the right, there's a lot of things that might have to come into play for it to be a rocket ship.
Absolutely.
I think the rocket ship visual is like a straight line. And I think that there's got to be a lot more. Like, I just highly doubt that anyone was like, oh, here's an idea. And then they put it into action and then it happened exactly like they thought it would, kind of like the process we are going through right now with like trying to figure out really what our identity is. So I think it's more like a car in the sense that there's lots of turns that are going to be made.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Any other thought?
I think it's like a car because Amazon was built in a garage and that's where cars are built. No, and honestly though, I think it's a rocket ship because, looking at it this way, there's a lot of like science and thought and preparation put in, and when the rocket goes up, it's a lot of power just to get it off into the sky out of the gravity, and a lot can go wrong, and if you mess up, you can't pull over. You know what I mean? It's like you're shooting for the stars or you're not. Um, so that's the way I see it. It's kind of a lot of planning up front and then sending it and hoping it goes the way you want.
Yeah, I think
Well,
go ahead.
no, go ahead. Go ahead. You're good.
Just going to say that, I remember the old adage of, I was an overnight 20-year success, right? And there's there's so much that happens behind the scenes to really make something become what it needs to be. And so, to whatever degree that looks like, I think, it could be a rocket ship if you're looking at the end product of when it's ready to launch. But I think that the car slug along has to happen for this, the rocket not to explode. So those are my thoughts.
Definitely. So in this book, we kind of look at the idea of a rocket ship, of this like planning ahead and kind of shooting it off, and just trying to do all this preparation and then thinking that it's going to just skyrocket and everyone's going to love it and it's going to be awesome. And that's kind of that rocket ship thought. But more so, we typically do, when we are successful in a startup, we'll typically drive it more like a car. And in this model, at least, there is a feedback loop and like a steering wheel that they call the build, measure, learn feedback loop. And through that process of steering, you can learn when and if it's time to make your sharp turns or your pivots, and whether you should preserve or stay on your current path. And once you have that engine that's revved up, the lean startup offers methods to scale and grow the business as fast as possible. So we do see some businesses, though, that end up being like a rocket ship. And that is something that we typically model our thoughts of entrepreneurship and a startup off of, because it's like, wow, look at that, so successful startup that, they just made something out of nothing and it just took off and it was amazing. But the reality of a startup is that it's a lot of pivoting, it's a lot of learning, it's a lot of changes and sticking the course and being able to be flexible. And that's something that this book really dives into. And it talks about driving a startup. So when we treat a startup like driving a car, throughout the process of driving, you always have a really clear idea of where you're going. So for example, when you're at home and you're going to work, you know exactly where you're going. And even if there's something that gets in your way, you'll make the turn and you'll go around and then you'll end up making it to work regardless. You'll remain really focused on getting to where you want to go. And that's really similar to how we function as a business, that we are really focused on that vision and you always want to find your way back to that vision. And in the book, they refer to it as a true north, and that's the destination mind. And the typical startup, it has this true north of creating a thriving and world-changing business. That's the vision that most startups employ. And then they start a strategy, and that includes their business model, their product roadmap, a point of view on partners and competitors, and ideas about who the customers will be. And then the product is the end result of that strategy. So on this page, you can kind of see that hierarchy there, that little chart. And then on here, we also see pivot and optimization. So in the strategy area, there are times that we find out, that wasn't the best thing that we could have done, or we should change how we're doing this. And so we end up calling that a pivot because we need to change our strategy, or we might have to optimize our products. It might be facing some really big competitors, or maybe it just really needs to be refined and changed and improved. But less frequent, but we almost never change our vision. We're always heading to the same direction. We always want to be chasing after the same thing, even if we need to be flexible about how we're going to get there or exactly how our product functions so that it can be the best. So one thing I wanted to ask y'all and kind of get your thoughts on is when to adapt and when not to, and if you think that your destination should ever change, or if you think that you should really stick to that one destination and make the other changes elsewhere. I think there are different opinions on this just because you might actually end up feeling like you should change your vision at some point. And if that's the case, what do you guys kind of think that that looks like, or how do you think that that would, I guess, rock an organization?
I think vision takes a lot of time to come up with, because there's so many factors that go into it. And part of vision is sort of extension of like your own passions. Part of it is the kind of market dynamics, understanding the client. So there's a lot that goes into it. I think generally speaking, if it's done right. So I would say but it is a destination. And so I think that's something that you have to be pretty thoughtful to come up with, and then pretty thoughtful to unwind if it really isn't. So I'd say that's got to be a real hard thing to move away from, would be my personal opinion. And then, the strategy stuff, I mean, I think that's just like nonstop, constant feedback loop of saying, I think the strategy is probably changing a lot. Not like it's just all the time, but that one is very fluid because of the dynamics of how you're going to have to go about approach it. So that's been my experience in different businesses, and you've got to be, constantly thinking about that strategy and poking holes in it. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Did anyone else have anything to add to that?
Initially, when I thought, like, when you asked the question, I was kind of thinking, if people don't put a lot of like thought into what the vision is, and it's like a hasty decision, and they kind of there's just not a lot of like thought and passion put behind it. I think like the vision should and can change, just so that it's like you really are like taking time to think it out. And so I feel like typically it's if like what's the saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it type of thing. I feel like you could kind of get fixated on that, like, oh, we have a vision already, and like, why would we change it? But if the vision isn't thought out, or the vision isn't really where you want to go, and you think about that, I think that it should change. And then like Dave said, with the strategy, I think that that's always going to be pivoting, because you're going to learn new things through experiences, successful failures, and just kind of road bumps along the way.
Sorry, I can't. There we go. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I absolutely agree with you. I think that something that's really important to remember is, like, vision, it shouldn't really change generally, because you made a lot of work and a lot of effort to create that vision and be headed in the right direction. But I do think that there are some times that you end up refining that vision, or changing it just to meet your needs, that maybe your vision wasn't really aimed the right way, and then you find out later along in the process. So obviously everyone has their own situations that come to fruition that need to be handled. So there's not really a golden rule to follow for everything, but typically, and in the terms of this book, you won't end up changing your vision. But you will end up having a lot of changes in the product or in the strategy. And that creates the great challenge of a startup, which is the fact that you'll have to start acquiring new customers. And then you need to, I don't know why this is doing this like this. Then you'll need to be serving your existing customers, improving the product, and then you're improving the marketing. And then at the same time, you should go ahead and improve the operations. And then you're deciding if we should pivot, and you're deciding when we should pivot, if we're going to pivot, and we're managing feedback loops, and we're forming strategic alliances. And as a startup, and when you're trying to run towards that vision, all of these things become so much to juggle. So this is kind of where the book leaves us off, and we go into the next chapter where it kind of starts talking about how you end up juggling these things. Um, but I wanted to open it up to like if anything here surprised you, or if anything that we do at Integrity Capital really stands out to you, that we're really driving Integrity Capital and we're great with making those pivots, or maybe where we would be better at making those pivots and how we could juggle best and how we could aim towards juggling all of those different challenges of a startup.
Nothing surprised me, just probably because I've read it before. So,
Yeah.
so I'd say nothing there, but it's good to go back through. I was in this morning, just going back through, and I think I'm at chapter 3 or 4. I can't remember, but I think at Integrity Capital, we really drive this idea of just constantly saying, okay, how do we grow? What do we need to do to change or improve? I think we've even gotten better at that through some of the successful failures that have happened over the last 6 to 9 months. And so, but I do think that, so point is, I think we do a lot of these things really well. I would say that we're just on the precipice of taking it to a whole nother level, to really hone in on this thing and say, how do we really start to build something that's very measurable, that's very data driven, that's not subjective in meaning like, hey, we're doing great. It's like, no, this is exactly what's going on and we can quantify it. And I think that's an area we need to get better. And I think we are going to move that direction and are. But so that just excites me to really have something real mapped out where we're isolating and just giving full, attention and affection towards something. So, yeah, so I've got lots of thoughts, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think what surprised me was the idea of just like, when you try to start something, there's just so much that goes into it. And then sometimes the hardest part is just starting. So once you start, that's when it really starts to kind of come together. And that's I thought that was really cool, like the rocket ship versus car, like it could go either which way. And then also, how do you think we drive integrity? I think we drive really well. Like we all have a really true north. Like we really know what our vision or mission is, and we're all aligned with that. And everything we do is aligned with that, with our values and how we're gonna pursue deals and how we're gonna do business with others. Really focused around like delighting the client, and then um how do we drive better? How could we drive better? I think we're always looking for ways to improve, with our proactive processes and serving others authentically. It's just, I think that we're always looking at different ways to be more efficient and also, like Dave said, data driven. I think if we limit the uncertainty, we're always going to know exactly where we stand, where we're going, what we're accomplishing, and what's not working. And also, how do we juggle better? I think it's just more of a function of how are we more efficient? If we're more efficient, then we're going to be able to take on more. But if we're not efficient, then we're going to be struggling to juggle. So I think it's just a balancing act of efficiency versus workload or whatever that load looks like.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Dan.
I would say surprised, but on the answer of the vision piece of, it was kind of good to hear that that's the part that shouldn't change. That's got to be the rock solid foundation, and then the thought of knowing that we've kind of always had our vision is delighting the client with a simple funding experience, and that's kind of our rock solid foundation. So I think that on that aspect, I think that's something where we've got a solid foundation. but I think we do a good job of trying to change the strategy, some innovation in the product and changing the strategy to make it so we can complete the vision. So I think we do a good job there, but yeah, always room for improvement.
Thank you, Tom. On my end, I think the thing that really surprised me the most in reading this was that visual of a rocket ship versus driving a car, because it definitely does make sense. Like, yeah, you're really heading towards your vision, and you shouldn't be trying to front load all of the planning, and you need to be ready to pivot and make changes.